Faster Together, the LinkedIn Live series of Women Business Collaborative. I'm Gwen Young, CEO of WBC, and today we are joined by one of our partner organizations and our champion, Sandra, Quince, and Brittany Cole, and we are thrilled. As you may know, WBC is an unprecedented alliance of over 80 organizations focused on women in business and hundreds of business leaders, building a movement to achieve equal position, pay, and power for all women in business. Through collaboration, advocacy, action, and accountability, we are mobilizing thousands to create momentum and accelerate the pace of change. WBC lives its commitment to DEI, and members of our leadership, our staff, our board of directors, and our champions include more than 34% people of color. And every one of our action initiatives has DEI goals for both 2025 and 2030. So please check the chat for those action initiatives through which we aim to accelerate change, and join our movement at wbcollaborative.org. Each week in this series, we offer different ways to advocate change and right impact by presenting data, research, and best practices, by lifting up the power of women's voices for change, and by showcasing leaders committed to allyship, inclusivity, and driving corporate purpose. So as we continue in Black History Month and beyond, allyship remains an important cultural component, particularly for Black women. Striving to promote equity in the workplace requires us all to work hard to be collaborators in the process and to be allies. And we know that the change starts with each of us taking responsibility for our individual behaviors. So with that frame, I'm excited to be joined in this conversation by Sandra Quince, the CEO of Paradigm for Parity, and Brittany Cole, the CEO of Career Thrivers. Welcome to you both.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Gwen, and a pleasure to share the virtual platform with you, Brittany.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here as well, Gwen. Thank you for having us.
I'm thrilled. And as usual, looking forward to this great conversation. So why don't we start with your lived experience, Sandra and Brittany? What does allyship look like for each of you? Maybe you want to talk about, a point in your career when allyship has shown up or when you realized it was allyship. And Brittany, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Yeah, so when I think about allyship, I think it is very aligned to the true definition of empathy. And empathy is all about stepping outside of your own lived experience, even somewhat your beliefs, which is the hard part, and to step fully into the mindset, the experience of someone else to better understand their walk of life. And so for me, before I took the leap of faith into entrepreneurship, founder and CEO of Career Thrivers, I spent 12 years as a commercial leader at Pfizer. And so I led sales and marketing there. And I have so many stories that popped up to the forefront of my mind when you asked that question about experiences with allyship. One that I'll lean on was the allyship of another woman. And you'll probably hear me talk about that a lot because I think oftentimes when we think about gender equity and we think about allyship, we automatically think about what men can do. And I think women being better allies for other women is paramount. So I had an ally. She was really a sponsor. So not only was she advocating for me, not only did she understand my lived experience at the organization at the time, my aspirations, what I saw for my career progression, but she was also the one in the room. I'll take a line from Carla Harris. She carried my paper into the room to advocate for me and to really what I call narrative correct, right? So you're in those meetings, those rooms that sometimes you don't have as executive leaders, you may have access to, but rooms that people that you're being an ally for and advocate for don't have access to. And as an ally, you have an opportunity when you hear narratives, especially when it comes to women, particularly when it comes to Black women, you have an opportunity to say, yes, and right. And she was that, her name's Pat. She was that woman for me in the room. And not only did she yes, and for me in the room that I wasn't in, but she came back and she said, hey, Brittany, here's what I heard in the room. And here's how you might want to go back and have conversations with your leader and your leader's leader to ensure that they are aligned with your aspirations so that they can speak on your behalf just as strongly as I can. So that's just one of many examples that I've had in my own career of what allyship actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, I think, Brittany, you're so spot on when you talk about allyship. And I think over the years, it has morphed. And we have to think about all of us being allies. We all have some level of personal privilege. And allyship is not just about men supporting women, but it's about women supporting women. And it's also about executives supporting mid-level leaders and mid-level leaders supporting those that are newer to the organization. And for me, when I think about allyship, I think there are several sort of key components that you really have to do in order to consider yourself an ally. And some of it will sort of morph into whether it's sort of mentoring, it's some of it is sponsoring, but some of those that fall outside of those realms is really being an upstander. So when you hear or you see something that's not correct, do you correct it? Because allies, they're upstanders, right? Allies are also continuous learners. You know, are you educating yourself on the issues? Because oftentimes what we do is we do like to lean on other people to educate us. But really, are you taking the opportunity to educate yourself and others around you? And there's so many different ways that you can do this. Yes, you can have the conversation with those you're trying to align yourselves with, but it's also a lot of material out there, movies you could watch, you know, books you could read. And so there's so many different ways. And also being proximate and being very understanding of where you do your shopping, right? Do you go to grocery stores outside of your neighborhood to be proximate to people who are different than you? So I think that's another way of being that continuous learner. I also think for allies, you need to show support for someone who doesn't have the same advantages, right? That's when you boil the definition of what an ally is, that really is what an ally can be. They basically help to be the voice and advocate for those that cannot or don't have the positional power to do that for themselves. And then what I really love about an ally is that you support and you amplify. That you know, I think Brittany, that was really what your ally did for you, supporting and then amplifying your voice in that space where you were not there. And I think of a time, you know, for me, and it was a very similar experience that Brittany had where I wasn't in the room. And, you know, every company does talent assessments and talent planning, and you have an opportunity to discuss talent. And oftentimes the people that are in those spaces are, of course, the leaders that have the influence. They're normally senior. And then you have your HR partners. And this is where I think it's imperative that we lean on our HR practitioners to be allies for all people, because a lot of times they're in those meetings and they hold the key to someone's success. And when you hear things that are being described about someone, such as the fact of, oh, she's aggressive, which has nothing to do with how she performs oftentimes in her work. And is she really aggressive, or is she just assertive and knowledgeable and confident? And so not having the voice and being able to speak up for yourself in those moments, you know, it is imperative that we have others being able to ask that question. And in my case, I had that ally being able to say, can you describe what that behavior really looked like? And when they did describe it, the person then said, that doesn't sound aggressive to me. That sounds knowledgeable and confident. And was she right? Yes. And it sort of flipped the script around as to what others were thinking, because those labels are very dangerous to people, to our careers. And so we need allies, and especially in the HR space.
Well, it's interesting that up too, because you talked, you know, Sandra and Brittany, both about sort of the evolution and what is allyship, and then sort of the individual piece. And I want to kind of bring it up to the organizational piece. Sandra, as you mentioned, like there's a role for HR that, you know, what are organizations doing? Like Brittany, you know, just told us you're working every day with organizations, shaping their strategy, building their leadership capabilities. Where is this allyship conversation showing up? Like, what are people talking about? Is it showing up? Is this a conversation piece that you see organizations having?
It absolutely is. And for us at Career Thrivers, we have a core curriculum that's called the Actions and Awareness of Allies. And I would say, in addition to Sandra's recommendation for HR business partners to be well versed in allyship, it is also incumbent upon mid-level managers, so the people leaders. When you look at the breadth and depth of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which, by the way, did not start in 2020. It started in the late 1960s with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's what introduced this idea of diversity work into the corporate space. So there are decades of examples. There are decades of stories and case studies around what works, what doesn't work, what what is sustainable, what's not. And so when you have a retrospective look at that, one thing that we know from an organizational development perspective, that oftentimes the work of inclusion and equity falls down in the middle. So executives will have an enterprise strategic priority. We saw that in Q4 of 2020, all of 2021. Grassroots energy has always been there, right? Through ERGs and affinity groups and business resource groups, right? And then there's that middle of the organization, the people leaders, who we like to call them the cultivators of the culture, where the skill of allyship really has to be developed. And so we work with organizations to help them think about leadership competencies and capabilities from the perspective of how do you help someone do two things, right? Two things that are like the floor of allyship. One, you've got to recognize difference, right? So this whole idea and concept of like, we're all the same and everyone's like that is the antithesis of allyship, because if you don't recognize where the differences are, you aren't able to advocate to bridge them. And then two, Sandra said this, is that we all have to recognize our own level of privilege. I grew up in a home with two college graduates. My mother was a graduate of the University of South Carolina. She was a Gamecock. My father was a pastor for almost all of my life. And so I grew up with privilege. I grew up with access to information, access to resources, access to tools that I would look at my peer group, my friend group, that sometimes they didn't have access to. And it's that recognition of where do you have privilege in the work that you get to do, in the life that you get to live, and how are you able to say, okay, because I know where I have an area of privilege in that space, that's really where I can advocate. And so really helping people leaders in the middle of the organization develop that not mindset that this is the right thing to do, but skill and how we develop leaders is one of the things that organizations can do to really move this work forward. Our framework, Allies, is actually an acronym. So it stands for awareness. The first L is for listening. The second L is for learning. The I is for inclusion. The E is for experiences. Your actual lived experiences matter. And then the S, we like to think of it as like the top of the triangle or the pyramid, if you will, for allyship is sponsorship. And we all have an opportunity to be a sponsor, to be an advocate, especially as you build brand equity and relationship capital within an organization. We all have that opportunity to extend that grace or to extend that privilege to someone else. And that's really at the core of what allyship looks like, so that these numbers that we like to throw around in the gender equity space actually start to shift.
Yeah. I couldn't, Brittany, you're speaking my language, right? You're saying all the good stuff, because that's exactly right. In that paradigm for parity, where we're dedicated to achieving gender parity at every level of leadership in corporate America with a lens on racial equity, allyship is critically important. But for us, we talk about it in the terms of mentorship and sponsorship. But we also have to recognize those are outputs of allyship, right? And so other things that organizations really need to be thinking about is they have to think about their workplace culture, because it is hard to speak up and speak out and have that sort of see something, say something mantra if your organization doesn't reward that good behavior. And so having the culture and the ability to create a path where people feel comfortable in speaking up and speaking out is critical. I think the other thing we have to do is go back to what Brittany talked about with those mid-level leaders. It is so critical that we continue to engage mid-level leaders. And I love, Brittany, what you shared. You're absolutely right. The grassroots, they're out there, they're doing the work and wanting to advocate and wanting to make shifts and change culturally. And of course, at the top of the house, they're setting strategy and understanding it. But it's that magic middle that you can really have an impact and really ensure that you're driving and moving your culture forward. And what you also have to help them to understand is how to invite others in to advocate, for others, right? That should be a part of their role. So how are you upskilling your leaders to understand how to be true leaders and not just managers of processes, but leaders of people? So inviting others and inviting them to understand that part of their role is to advocate for others. And then the last part about allyship that I'd like to mention that I absolutely love is this notion around recognizing and correcting exclusion. And so when you're sitting in a space, no matter what level you are in an organization, who's missing? What's missing? And how are you then advocating to ensure that you bring in what's missing? Who's not at the table? Whose voice aren't you hearing from? Because that's a part of allyship as well.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think what becomes interesting too is as we think about this, I want to kind of take it from two angles, right? There's the learning piece of it, which you brought up earlier, Sandra, what we're learning and sort of the broader definition and more of a whose voices, who needs to be there and how do we do that? Even this middle manager piece of it, right? Which might have been something 10 years ago in allyship we were speaking about fully, right? But second, where is the, as we're a collaborative in WBC, what role can we play? Like, and you guys are all a part of our collaborative. So how can you work both internally, collaboratively, either within an organization or with other organizations to really, build on those learnings and make it actionable, your commitment to allyship?
Yeah, so I can start, right? So I think it starts with conversations like this. And I also think it starts with holding ourselves accountable, as organizations who are really looking to ensure that we're advancing women in the workplace, that we have to be talking about all of these things. When you think about all the things that WBC and its partners do, from pay parity to sponsorship and everything in between, we have to continue to have the conversations and ensure that we are sprinkling allyship as a part of that. Because when you think about pay parity, it's about speaking up and ensuring and advocating, right? That's allyship. When you think about sponsorship, it's opening the doors. And I love what you said about Carla Harris and carrying that paper in the room. That's allyship as well. And so we have to be able to continue to sprinkle that message and have a consistent message when we're going out and talking about all of these various areas in which we all have sort of a subject matter expertise, but ensuring that we're rowing in the same direction together.
Thing that a collaborative such as the WBC can do and the organizations that are connected to it is to be specific. So one of the things that I pride myself, our organization on, is we think about the work of inclusion and equity as a business function. So the same way that you approach sales and marketing in your organization is the same way that we approach the work of inclusion and equity. And so you would not go out to expand a market with a new product without being very clear on, one, what is the product? Who's the target audience? Like, you'd be very specific when it comes to the data. And so I know the topic of this conversation is around allyship for Black women. And I think one of the ways that the collaborative organizations can be more specific is actually ensuring that when we're talking about the work of diversity, which is just as broad as saying, we do a lot of work in the manufacturing automotive industry with organizations. So it's just as broad off to say it's saying the word tires. Like, what type of tire are we talking about, right? What type of tread? Like, what vehicle is it going on? Like, there's so many different variations. And so I think when we think about the work of diversity, oftentimes people have a picture in their mind of what that means, not recognizing that we really need to disaggregate the data. So the last Women in the Workplace report from 2023, if we're just talking about disaggregating the data just for a moment, when you look at the representation of women from entry-level roles to the C-suite, obviously we know there's a difference between men and women, right? And the difference in the data is clear. As you move from entry-level to C-suite, the representation, the number increases, right? That's the only demographic where that is true. But then when you disaggregate women and you look at women compared to women of color, and that's as deep as this report even goes, white women are represented at 29% at entry level and 22% in the C-suite. Women of color are represented at 18% at entry level and 6% in the C-suite. And might I add that even with that level of specificity in the data, women of color is still a grouping, right? It is still not disaggregated to show the representation of Black women at those levels. And so I think one thing that we must continue to do, and thanks to organizations like Lean In and Women in the Workplace and the WBC, who pride ourselves on the research and actually what are the numbers, I think continuing those conversations to, even in this current season of where are we with DE&I, right? As a question, I know that's not the topic for today, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention it. I think it's important that organizations still understand that, one, the workforce is only continuing to become more diverse. Two, the work isn't really going anywhere despite the political year that we're in. And then 3, as a result of that, how do we continue to move the needle by being specific in terms of taking a look at how we're actually making progress within specific groups?
That's the perfect, you see me going like this, because WBC is actually working on this Women of Color report, which we want to launch mid-June, where we really want to break down the groups, not just by race and ethnicity. We want to get also to kind of, I noticed a comment in the chat, but there's age, there's regions, but starting even with that women of color, let's break that group down. Let's find out what data exists, get what data we can to really have that conversation to understand that piece of it. We are coming up, we are right at time, but I want to give each of you sort of the 10, 15 second, you sort of said the call to action. I heard clarity. I heard disaggregate the data. I heard, diversity, equity, inclusion is going nowhere. We still need to do the work, right? The notion of allyship has evolved. We're learning. Any other quick, I'll start with you, Sandra, sort of quick call to action to the audience before we have to close out the conversation?
Yeah, I'd just like to just reiterate what we both shared earlier around sort of thinking about what you're doing with your manager population. And I love what Brittany said. This is Black History Month. And as you think about Black women, we're not even a monolith. And so there's much work to be done, because as women are making progress, women of color are not making the same level of progress. And so what does allyship really look like for women, but for all women? And I think organizations have to be considerate of that.
Absolutely. Brittany?
My call to action would be to search for, share, and amplify the stories of diverse women across all intersections within your organizations. One of the most powerful, timeless ways to create change in any institution is through storytelling. And I think it's low-hanging fruit that many organizations overlook. Would love to invite you all to join us on the Let's Thrive Together podcast. I host a podcast every week where we are sharing the stories of women and men who are thriving in their career as leaders. And I think that storytelling piece goes a long way to ensure that the workplace is cultivated, the culture is cultivated in such a way that everyone believes that they belong.
Yeah, that goes in with that listening piece, like who we are and accepting that we do have differences and listening to the story so we can understand. So thank you both. You are both two of my favorite leaders and storytellers, but that is all we have time for today. So we invite everyone to wbccollaborative.org to learn more about our initiatives to increase women in the C-suite and boardroom, to address the underrepresentation of women in STEM, entrepreneurship, and women as controllers of capital, and to advance a pipeline of women leaders and all women leaders that are going to bring gender, equity, inclusion, and diversity to the business landscape. So join us weekly to keep up to date on our movement, the work that we're all doing together, and the latest issues by following us on social media at WB Collaborative on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Brittany. And let's continue this conversation of allyship. And I appreciate your allyship.